I never thought I'd be the person posting a story like this on the internet, but my parents sold my 10-year-old daughter Lily's inheritance just to build a luxury home theater, and now our entire family is completely torn apart. The worst part isn't even the betrayal itself, though that's enough to make me sick. It's what happened when they realized the exact nature of the asset they sold. They thought they were being clever, that they found a loophole to fund their retirement comfort on the back of a little girl's future. But they didn't bother to read between the lines, and the books were completely cooked in a way they never saw coming. Was I wrong for unleashing the full weight of the law on my own mother and father? Or would you have done the exact same thing if someone stole your child's future for a couple of leather recliners and a massive projector screen? Let me take you back to how this nightmare actually started, because to understand why this hurts so badly, you need to understand who my grandfather was. My grandfather, Arthur, was a quiet, meticulous man who spent his entire life working as an independent accountant and collecting rare, vintage books and historical manuscripts. He wasn't a millionaire by any means, but he was incredibly smart with his money and invested deeply in things he loved. When my daughter Lily was born, she became the absolute center of his world. Even as a toddler, she would sit quietly in his study, completely fascinated by the old leather bindings and the smell of the ancient paper. As she grew older, my grandfather started teaching her about the history behind his collection, showing her how to handle the pages with care and treating her like a true apprentice. He used to tell her that books weren't just pages bound together, but time capsules holding the blood, sweat, and secrets of the people who came before us. My parents, on the other hand, never cared for his passion. To my mother, his study was just a dusty room full of old junk that smelled like mildew, and my father constantly joked that Arthur should just sell the whole lot and buy a boat. They had this incredibly shallow, materialistic view of the world, which always put a strain on their relationship with my grandfather. When Arthur was diagnosed with a terminal illness 2 years ago, he called me into his study privately. He told me that he knew my parents would try to liquidate everything he owned the second he was gone to fund their lavish lifestyle, so he had structured his will very carefully. He left his house and his basic bank accounts to my parents, which was already a substantial amount, but he specifically left his entire curated collection of rare books and a separate, private trust fund directly to Lily. Because Lily was only 8 at the time, the will designated my parents as the temporary executors of the physical estate until she turned 18, but with a strict legal clause that the collection was never to be sold, divided, or altered. It was meant to be preserved for Lily, who truly loved it. I was named as the trustee of her financial trust, which meant my parents couldn't touch her money, but since the books were physically kept in the large library room of my grandfather's house, which my parents inherited and moved into, they had physical custody of the collection. I thought we were safe. I thought that even my parents wouldn't be malicious enough to violate a dead man's final wishes and rob their own granddaughter. But I severely underestimated how greedy and short-sighted my parents could be. About 6 months ago, my mother started dropping hints about how expensive the upkeep on the old house was. She kept complaining that they needed to modernize the place, and my father became obsessed with the idea of converting the large, insulated library room into a state-of-the-art home theater system. He started talking about getting a massive laser projector, custom soundproofing, rows of motorized leather recliners, and a built-in bar. Every time we went over for dinner, that's all he would talk about. I explicitly reminded him that the room was currently housing Lily's library and that those books belonged to his granddaughter. My father would just scoff and say that a 10-year-old didn't need thousands of dusty old books and that she could just read everything on an iPad anyway. I told him in no uncertain terms that if they ever touched a single page of that collection, I would take legal action. My mother smiled her fake, sweet smile and assured me that they were just dreaming and would never actually do anything to upset Lily. I stupidly believed her. Then, 3 weeks ago, Lily and I went over to their house unannounced on a Saturday afternoon to drop off some paperwork. The moment we walked through the front door, the house sounded different. There was the distinct noise of heavy drilling, hammering, and loud country music coming from the back wing. Lily, excited to visit her grandfather's old study, ran ahead of me down the hallway. By the time I caught up to her, she was standing in the doorway of the library, tears streaming down her face. The room was completely gutted. The beautiful floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves that my grandfather had built with his own hands were being ripped from the walls by a construction crew. The room was stripped down to the drywall, and sitting in the middle of the floor were boxes of wires, speakers, and brochures for high-end home theater seating. Every single one of my grandfather's rare books was gone. There wasn't a trace of his life's work left in that room. I completely lost my mind. I demanded to know where the books were, screaming for my parents. My mother came walking down the hall, holding a glass of wine, looking completely unbothered. When she saw Lily crying, she didn't even try to comfort her. She just sighed and told me I was making a scene. I grabbed my mother by the arm, not hurting her, but forcing her to look at the empty room, and asked her what she did with Lily's inheritance. My father walked in right behind her, smelling like sawdust and looking incredibly smug. He told me to calm down and said they did what was best for the family. He explained that a high-end estate buyer had come through town, and they had sold the entire book collection as a single lot for a whopping $85,000. He boasted about how they used that money to completely fund the home theater construction and pay off their credit card debt, saying that Lily would get far more enjoyment out of watching movies on a giant screen during family nights than staring at old paper. Lily was absolutely heartbroken. She ran out of the house and hid in the car, sobbing because the last physical connection she had to her beloved grandfather had been sold off like garage sale junk. I turned to my parents and told them that they had just committed grand theft and violated a binding legal will, and that I was going to ruin them for this. My mother laughed in my face. She said the books were in her house, Arthur was dead, and there was nothing a 10-year-old could do about it anyway. They honestly thought they were completely untouchable. So that is the exact situation I was thrown into, and I was forced to make a choice that would change our family dynamic forever. Before I tell you about the absolute chaos that happened next, and how the books turned out to be a ticking financial time bomb for my parents, I want you to pause right here and comment below. What would you have done if your own parents stole from your child like this? Would you have called the police, or would you have tried to handle it quietly within the family? Let me know your thoughts down there, because I really need to know if my anger was justified. Now, let me tell you how their little home theater dream turned into an absolute financial and legal execution. The very next morning, I contacted the estate lawyer who had handled my grandfather's will. When I told him what my parents had done, I could hear the sheer disbelief and anger in his voice. He confirmed that what they did was highly illegal. Because my parents were only the custodians of the physical property, and not the owners, selling the collection constituted a massive breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and outright theft. The lawyer immediately drafted a formal cease and desist order and filed a motion in court to freeze my parents' involvement with the estate. But the real twist came 48 hours later, and it's the reason why I say the books were completely cooked. I received a frantic, breathless phone call from my mother. She was screaming so loudly into the receiver that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Apparently, the high-end estate buyer they had sold the collection to wasn't just a casual collector. He was an expert appraiser who specialized in antiquarian texts. He had spent the last 2 days meticulously cataloging every single book my grandfather owned, and what he discovered changed everything. My grandfather wasn't just collecting these books for their historical value. He was an accountant, remember? He had used the collection as a highly sophisticated, completely legal, but incredibly complex tax, shelter, and investment portfolio. Inside the covers of several key first edition manuscripts, my grandfather had hidden certified certificates of authenticity, independent appraisals, and specific writers that linked the physical books to a private, offshore insurance policy and an active investment bond. Furthermore, 3 of the books in that collection weren't just worth a few $1,000s. They were extremely rare, centuries-old religious and scientific texts that my grandfather had purchased decades ago, which had appreciated exponentially in value. The actual, verified market value of the entire collection wasn't $85,000. It was valued at just over $420,000. My parents, in their absolute haste to get quick cash for their stupid home theater, had sold a nearly $500,000 inheritance for pennies on the dollar to a buyer who legally bought it under the assumption that the sellers had the right to sell it. But it gets even worse for them. The buyer, realizing the true immense value of the collection and suddenly receiving a legal notice from my lawyer stating the items were stolen property, panicked. He didn't want to be charged with receiving stolen goods or trafficking in illicit antiquities. So, to protect himself, the buyer immediately went to the police and turned over the entire bill of sale, the text messages, and the emails showing my parents eagerly pushing for a fast, cash-only sale to avoid paper trails. The police opened a criminal investigation into my parents for grand larceny and fraud. When my mother called me, she wasn't apologizing for stealing from Lily. She was begging me to drop the lawsuit and tell the police it was all a big misunderstanding because the buyer was threatening to sue them for fraud to get his $85,000 back, and the police were talking about jail time. She actually had the audacity to say, "If we go to jail, we'll lose the house, and then Lily won't have a place to come visit us." I told her that she should have thought about that before she traded her granddaughter's future for a projector screen. I refused to drop anything. I pressed full criminal charges on behalf of my daughter. The aftermath has been an absolute circus of poetic justice. The police seized the home theater equipment as assets bought with stolen funds. The construction on their house has completely halted, leaving them with a ruined, half-demolished room full of exposed wires and drywall dust, a literal monument to their own greed. Because of the criminal charges and the impending lawsuits from both me and the defrauded buyer, my parents had to put the very house they inherited from my grandfather on the market just to afford their criminal defense attorneys and try to pay back the funds. They are facing potential prison sentences. Their reputation in our community is completely destroyed, and my siblings are all furious at them for bringing this shame onto the family. As for the collection, the police successfully recovered every single book from the buyer, and they are now safely locked away in a climate-controlled, secure professional storage facility, fully insured, where my parents can never touch them again. Lily knows that her grandfather protected her even from beyond the grave, and she's comforted knowing his life's passion is safe. My parents keep sending me messages, calling me a monster for destroying their retirement and ruining their lives over a bunch of old paper, but I haven't responded to a single one. They chose a home theater over their own family, and now they get to sit in the quiet ruins of their own making. Looking back on this entire mess, I've realized that greed truly blinds people to the value of what really matters in life. My parents saw an opportunity to exploit a child's inheritance for short-term luxury, completely ignoring the love, history, and immense value that my grandfather had carefully built for Lily's future. They thought they could outsmart the system, but in the end, their own ignorance and lack of respect for his legacy became their undoing. If you think I did the right thing by standing up for my daughter and holding my parents legally accountable for their betrayal, please hit the like button on this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking family drama and revenge stories just like this one, and definitely share your final thoughts on this whole crazy situation in the comments section below. I'll be down there reading your responses. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you all in the next story.